The words hit Belle Turner like a closed fist, sharp and sudden in the dry desert air. "The frontier is cruel to dreamers," Henry Brooks said, his voice low and certain, the way a man speaks when he has watched enough people break against a land that never once apologized for what it did to them. His dark eyes held hers from across the narrow width of the sheriff's office doorway, and there was no cruelty in them, only something worse, a settled, suffocating pity. "I have seen 100 people ride into this territory with stars in their eyes. I have buried most of them." Belle stood in the late afternoon sun of Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, the year 1882, her leather satchel pressed to her side, and the deed to her brother's claim folded inside her coat. Every bone in her body was sore from 3 days on a stagecoach. Every nerve was raw from what she had found when she arrived. A burned-out farmstead, a grave marked with a crude wooden cross, and a town that looked at her with the particular quiet of people who had already decided her fate for her. "I am not a dreamer," she said, Henry's jaw tightened. "Miss Turner, I am not finished." She took one step forward and held his gaze without flinching. "My brother is dead. His land is mine by legal deed. Someone in this town drove him off it, burned his house, and put a bullet in him, because that is what the physical evidence of that grave and those ashes tells me. I am not here to dream, Mr. Brooks. I am here to prove exactly what happened, take back what belongs to me by law, and make certain that whoever killed my brother answers for it." She paused just long enough to let each word settle into the dry earth between them. "So you can take your warnings about the frontier and keep them for someone who needs them." There was a full 4 seconds of silence in Harlan Creek that felt longer than a year. Then Henry Brooks, the sheriff of that same hard little town, stepped back from the doorway with an expression that Belle could not quite name, something between shock and something else, something that looked dangerously close to respect, and he said, "You had better come inside, then." She proved it, but that was not where the story began. 3 weeks earlier, Belle Turner had been standing behind the counter of her employer's dress shop on the respectable side of Santa Fe, stitching a hem she had already stitched 100 times before, when the letter arrived. It came by post rider and was addressed in her brother Daniel's handwriting, her younger brother, who had ridden out to the New Mexico Territory 2 years prior with a surveying map, a mule named Caleb, and the absolute conviction that a man could build a life on honest labor and good land. Belle had not tried to stop him. She had been 24 to his 22, and she had known that Daniel needed to try. The letter inside was not from Daniel. It was from a man named Amos Prout, who described himself as a neighbor, and it told her in 3 careful sentences that Daniel Turner had died of a riding accident 6 weeks prior, that his property on the eastern edge of the Harlan Creek claim basin had been taken over by a man named Calhoun Reed for unpaid debts, and that as Daniel's only living relative, she might wish to come collect any personal effects before those 2 were disposed of. 3 sentences. 6 weeks late. Belle had read that letter 4 times standing at the shop counter, and what she felt was not grief at first. Grief came later that night when she was alone. What she felt first was the deep, cold clarity of betrayal. The word unpaid debts lit something behind her sternum like a match touching dry grass, because Daniel Turner had no debts. He had written her every month for 2 years. He had been saving. He had been building something real, something brick by careful brick, and the last letter she had received from him, 3 months before Amos Prout's, had said that the spring crops were coming in strong and that he thought he had found water on the north end of the property. Men with water-producing land and strong spring crops did not die of riding accidents. Belle had set down the letter, finished her shift with steady hands, gone home, and spent exactly 1 evening in grief. In the morning she had packed what she needed, collected the savings she had been building since she was 19 years old, $47, which was not a fortune, but was considerably more than most people expected a dressmaker's assistant to possess. And she had gone to the land records office in Santa Fe, where she had the deed to Daniel's property transferred to her name as next of kin, which was entirely legal and took the clerk 3 hours of searching and 2 cups of coffee to confirm. But he confirmed it. Then she had boarded the southbound stage. The road into Harlan Creek took her through country that was enormous and beautiful in a way that had nothing soft about it. The mesas stood red and golden against a sky that went on past any horizon Belle had ever known, and the silence of the land was not peaceful so much as it was absolute. A silence that made clear it had existed before anyone arrived and would go right on existing after everyone left. She found it bracing rather than frightening, which told her something about herself that she filed away for later consideration. The stagecoach brought her through the town of Harlan Creek at mid-morning 2 days after she had sent a wire ahead, and her first impression of the place was accurate, as first impressions of small frontier towns often are. It was a single main street with a saloon, a dry goods store, a livery stable, a small church that looked newer than everything else, a barber shop, and a structure at the far end with a tin star nailed to the door that served as the sheriff's office and jail combined. There were perhaps 40 buildings in total, some residential, and the whole thing was organized around the fact that water was precious and shade was not guaranteed. The stagecoach driver let her down in front of the dry goods store, and the town looked at her with the quality of quiet she recognized immediately as the quiet of people with something to hide. She went straight to the land records office, which was a small room at the back of the town clerk's building, and found it locked. A sign said it opened at 2 in the afternoon. She went then to find her brother's property, which she located by the map she had copied in Santa Fe, and what she found was the burned-out farmstead and the grave she had already described, along with a fence that had been erected around the entire property, bearing a sign with the name Reed Cattle Co. painted on it in black letters that were still fresh enough to glitter in the sun. She stood at her brother's grave for a long time. Then she went to the sheriff's office. Henry Brooks had been the sheriff of Harlan Creek for 4 years when Belle Turner walked up to his door. He was 31 years old, and he carried those years in a particular way, not heavily, but carefully, the way a man carries something he knows is fragile even if it looks solid. He had come to Harlan Creek from Tucson with a history he did not advertise, and a skill with a firearm he preferred not to use, and he had spent 4 years building something in that town that he believed in, which was the small and stubborn idea that the law could mean something even out here where the land was vast and consequences were easy to avoid. He had been struggling with that belief for the past 3 months, which was exactly how long Calhoun Reed had been operating in Harlan Creek with impunity. Calhoun Reed was a cattleman from Texas who had arrived in the territory with money, a crew of 8 armed riders, and a legal team in Santa Fe that had a talent for producing paperwork. He had acquired 4 properties in the Harlan Creek Basin in the span of 6 weeks, all of them claimed by smaller operations, all of the acquisitions supported by debt documentation that the previous owners swore they had never signed. 2 of those previous owners had simply left. One had been badly beaten and then left. The 4th had been Daniel Turner, and Daniel Turner had ended up in the ground. Henry had investigated. He had sent wires to Santa Fe about the debt documents. He had spoken to Reed's crew, which was like speaking to walls that wore hats. He had found nothing he could take before a circuit judge, and he had stood in the middle of that failure every day for 3 months knowing that Reed was watching him and calculating exactly how long a sheriff's conscience could sustain itself against a man with unlimited money and a legal team that knew every gap in territorial law. He had not expected Belle Turner. He had received her wire the day before she arrived and read it twice, and then he had folded it into his coat pocket and spent the night working out how to tell her that her brother's death was something he suspected and could not prove, and that the property was occupied by a man with lawyers, and that the frontier had eaten better people than her brother, and that she should perhaps go back to wherever she had come from. He had not anticipated that she would come to his door and take those words apart before he had even fully assembled them. He made her coffee on the small iron stove in the corner of his office. She sat across from his desk in the straight-backed chair that was there for deputies and visitors, and she did not fidget, which he noticed. Most people who came into his office fidgeted. The proximity of a law office in the middle of an unlawful territory had that effect. "Tell me what you know," she said. He told her what he knew, which was more than he had told anyone. He was not entirely sure why he was so forthcoming, except that she looked at him with complete attention, the kind of attention that took information seriously and processed it without drama, and he found himself responding to that attention the way a man responds when he has been mostly talking to walls for 3 months. He told her about the debt documents, about the pattern of acquisition, about the timing, about the fact that Daniel Turner had reported finding water on the north end of his property approximately 6 weeks before he died and approximately 1 week before the first of the debt documents against him had been filed in the town clerk's office. Belle listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "Someone witnessed the filing of those documents." "The town clerk," Henry said. "Is he honest?" Henry thought about it. "He is frightened," he said finally. "There is a difference." "Yes," she said, "there is." She reached into her satchel and produced a folded piece of paper which she set on his desk. "That is my legal deed to the property, transferred in Santa Fe 4 days ago. It is entirely valid. I checked the territorial code myself before I went to the records office." He looked at it. "Reed's lawyers will contest it." "On what grounds? I am Daniel Turner's only living relative. The law is clear on inheritance. Let them contest it." She met his gaze steadily. "I am not here to fight with guns, Mr. Brooks. I am here to build a legal case, which is where you come in." "Miss Turner," he said slowly, "Calhoun Reed is dangerous, I know." She said it the way she might say whether. "He is also a criminal, which means he has made mistakes, and mistakes leave evidence. The question is finding it before he realizes I am a serious threat, and not simply a grieving woman who will go away." She paused. "I need you to help me find it." He looked at her for a long moment. Henry Brooks had spent 4 years in Harlan Creek becoming very good at reading people. It was a skill that mattered more in this work than the firearm he kept in his holster. He read Belle Turner now, the straightness of her spine, the quality of her stillness, the way her grief was present in her face like a deep current beneath perfectly controlled surface water. And what he read was not a dreamer. What he read was a woman who had made a decision and intended to execute it with or without him, and whose only question about him was whether he was worth including. "All right," he said. It was perhaps the most consequential thing he said all year. Over the following 3 days, an arrangement was established. Belle took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Caldwell, who was one of the few people in Harlan Creek who looked at Belle without that quality of careful quiet. Mrs. Caldwell had been in the territory long enough to respect a woman who showed up with a deed in her pocket and something solid in her eyes, and she gave Belle a clean room and honest meals, and did not ask questions that weren't her business. Henry visited the boarding house every evening after he had made his rounds, and they sat at the small table in Mrs. Caldwell's front room with a lamp between them and worked through what they had. Belle had a notebook that she had begun filling from the moment she arrived, and the thoroughness of it impressed him in a way he tried not to show too obviously. She had already spoken to Amos Prout, the neighbor who had written to her, and she had discovered 2 things. First, that Prout was one of the frightened ones, that Reed's crew had visited his property twice, and second, that Prout had been present at the creek crossing on the morning of Daniel's death, and that the story he had been told to tell riding accident did not match what he had actually witnessed, which he had not told anyone because he valued being alive. "He will testify if he feels safe enough," Belle said. "Reed's crew watches every trail out of the valley," Henry said. "Any rider going toward a telegraph office or toward the circuit judge's territory gets followed." "Then we do not use a rider." Belle looked at him across the lamplight. There is a woman in town who takes the supply wagon to Albuquerque once a month to collect goods for the dry goods store. Her name is Mrs. Flores. She has been making that trip for 9 years. Reed's men do not watch her because she is a woman going to collect fabric and flour. Henry was quiet for a moment. You spoke to her. I did. She is willing to carry a sealed letter to the circuit judge's office in Albuquerque if we write one worth carrying. Belle's eyes met his. It needs to come from you. He looked at the steady lamp flame for a moment. Writing to the circuit judge was a formal escalation. It was a declaration that he was moving against Reed openly, and once that was done, Reed would know it and things would shift. Things could become dangerous. What do you want to say to the circuit judge? He asked. Belle opened her notebook and began to read, and what she had written was not a grieving letter, not a desperate plea, but a precise accounting dates, names, financial transactions, the timing of the water discovery, and the timing of the first debt document. The pattern of acquisition across all 4 properties, Amos Pruitt's willingness to provide a sworn statement, and the legal irregularities in the debt documentation that she had identified by comparing the formatting of the documents against the territorial legal code she had brought with her in a copy she had purchased from a Santa Fe legal office. She had brought the territorial legal code. Henry had to take a moment with that. Miss Turner, he said when she finished reading, how long did it take you to prepare all of this? I started on the stagecoach, she said simply. He drafted the letter that night, using her outline, and they went over it 3 times before he sealed it. Mrs. Flores took it 2 days later under a basket of eggs and a bolt of calico that she needed to return to the supplier. And she was back in Harlan Creek in 6 days with a response from the circuit judge's clerk that said the judge would be in Harlan Creek within 3 weeks with a full federal inquiry team, contingent on receiving sworn statements from witnesses. 3 weeks was not a long time. It was also not a short time, in a town where the wrong man had 8 armed riders and had already killed at least once. Calhoun Reed was a large man in his late 40s with a face that had been lived in, hard and pale eyes that had the quality of very cold water, not evil-looking exactly, but utterly without warmth, the way some country is not evil but will kill you without any particular feeling about it. He had heard about Belle Turner within 24 hours of her arrival, which was how things worked in small towns, and he had sent one of his riders to the boarding house on her second day with a message inviting her to come to his office at the Reed Cattle Company premises, which he had set up in a building on the north end of Main Street, to discuss the property matter, which he described as a simple legal misunderstanding. Belle went. She brought Henry. Reed's office was expensively appointed for the frontier, with a real desk imported from somewhere east and a Persian carpet that was slightly too fine for the adobe floor beneath it, and Reed sat behind the desk with 2 of his riders standing at the back of the room in the way that was meant to communicate something without stating it. He looked at Henry and then at Belle, and he smiled with all of his teeth. Miss Turner, he said, I understand your grief. The loss of a brother is a serious thing. It is, Belle said pleasantly, which is why I intend to take it seriously. Reed's smile did not waver, but something behind his pale eyes recalculated. Property was taken against outstanding debt. This is documented. I would like to see those documents, Belle said. My legal team is in Santa Fe, Belle said. I have the legal deed to the property in my possession and filed with this town's records office as of yesterday morning. If your documentation is valid, it will prove itself to the court. I look forward to seeing it do so. She smiled back at him with exactly as much warmth as he had shown, which was none at all, and stood up. Thank you for the meeting. They were outside and walking back down the main street before Henry said, quietly, he is going to move against you. I know, Belle said, with the same tone she used for everything practical. Which is why I spent this morning moving first. She glanced at him sideways. I filed a formal notice of contested property ownership with the town clerk, in triplicate. 1 copy is with the clerk. 1 copy is with Mrs. Caldwell for safekeeping. One copy left this morning with Mrs. Flores on her personal correspondence, addressed to a law firm in Albuquerque that I wrote to 3 days ago. Any action Reed takes against the property now is on record as occurring while ownership is legally contested. His lawyers will know what that means. Henry looked at her. He kept looking at her for what was probably a beat too long. You already had a lawyer in Albuquerque. I contacted one before I left Santa Fe, she said. A Mr. Esteban Vargas who was recommended by the land records clerk there. He is familiar with Reed's land acquisition pattern in this territory, as it turns out. He has been waiting for someone to bring a formal complaint. Henry stopped walking for a moment. Miss Turner. She turned to look at him. I need to tell you something, he said, and his voice had changed slightly, dropped out of the professional register into something more honest and less certain. When you came to my door that first day, I was prepared to tell you to go home. I thought you were going to be one more person this territory broke. He paused. I was wrong about that, and I want you to know that whatever happens with the judge in the case, I am not helping you because it is my job. I am helping you because it is right, and because you are the first person who has come into this office in 3 months and made me feel like right can still hold. Belle looked at him for a long moment in the desert morning sun, with the red mesas behind him and the dry, clean air between them, and something shifted in the careful composure of her face. Not much, but enough. Thank you, she said. That matters. It was perhaps the most honest thing either of them had said. That evening at Mrs. Caldwell's table, the dynamic between them was slightly different. The professional precision was still there, but beneath it something else had opened up, a quality of ease, of two people who had stopped performing competence for each other and could simply be inside a shared purpose. Henry brought a bottle of good coffee he had purchased from the dry goods store, which was a luxury in Harlan Creek, and Belle made the actual coffee on Mrs. Caldwell's stove, while Henry sat at the table with her notebook open, going over the witness list. Tell me about yourself, Belle said from the stove, which surprised him because she was not a person who asked questions that were not strategic. What would you like to know, he said. What brought you to Harlan Creek specifically? She poured the coffee and brought the cups to the table and sat down across from him with the lamp between them the way they always were, but differently. You could be sheriff anywhere. Why here? He was quiet for a moment. He had a dark past that he carried carefully, the way you carry something that might break if you're not deliberate about it. There was a man I failed to stop in Tucson, he said finally. A man who had the same style as Reed: money, lawyers, the appearance of legitimacy. He took 3 families' properties and was never prosecuted. 2 of those families lost people. He turned his coffee cup on the table. I was a deputy then. I knew what he was doing and I could not prove it, and I watched the law fold around him because the law is only as strong as the people holding it up. When the sheriff position opened in Harlan Creek, I came here because I thought a smaller place might be one where a single person could make the difference. He looked at the coffee cup. Some days I believe that more than others. Belle was quiet for a moment. You were not wrong to believe it, she said. It just required the right circumstances. And the right person, he said, and he looked up from the coffee cup at her, and the lamp was very warm between them, and the night outside was wide and full of stars that were close enough in New Mexico to feel like a presence. And they stayed at that table for another 2 hours, talking about things that had nothing to do with Calhoun Reed at all, about the look of Santa Fe at dawn, about the quality of eastern sky just before the sun crests a mesa, about what they had each wanted as children before the world had instructed them in what was practical. Belle had wanted to be a surveyor, which she said with the faint amusement of a person relating a secret she has kept for so long it has become merely interesting rather than painful. Her father had explained at length why that was not a viable ambition for a woman in 1870, and she had listened and filed it away and found other ways to be precise about the world. You should have been a lawyer, Henry said. I know, she said, without bitterness. Perhaps my children can be. Then she seemed briefly surprised at herself for saying it, and she looked down at her coffee cup, and Henry looked at the window that was full of stars, and the silence between them was warm rather than empty. He walked back to his office that night through the main street of Harlan Creek, and 3 of Reed's riders were sitting outside the saloon, and he could feel them watching him, calculating the weight of his resolve, trying to determine whether he was the kind of man who could be broken from his purpose by the right application of threat. He met each of their gazes as he walked past and did not look away, and he kept walking, and behind his sternum something had settled into a clarity he had not felt in months. The threat came 2 nights later. Belle found it when she returned to her boarding house room. The window was open that she always kept closed, and on the pillow was a single paper with 5 words written on it: "Leave now or share his grave." The handwriting was careful and deliberate, not the scrawl of a man writing in anger, and that careful deliberateness made it worse somehow, made it feel like a promise rather than a threat. She did not leave. She took the note to Henry at 7 in the morning and put it on his desk. Henry read it, and his face went very still with a quality of controlled anger that was somehow more serious than the explosive kind. "I am posting a deputy at the boarding house," he said. "That will tell Reed that he got to me," Belle said. "It will also put another person at risk. I appreciate the instinct, but I would rather we use this." She nodded at the note. "This is evidence of intent. It also means Reed is feeling the pressure, which means we are doing the right things." She sat down in the visitor's chair. "How long until the circuit judge?" 12 days, Henry said. "Then we need 3 more sworn statements before he arrives to add to proofs. I have been speaking with 2 of the other families whose properties Reed acquired." She opened her notebook. "One of them, a man named Soto who lost his eastern pasture land, is willing to swear to the same pattern of documentation that appeared against Daniel's property. The timing is identical, and there is a man who worked for Reed's legal team in Santa Fe for 6 weeks before he left in a disagreement about fees. I tracked him down through a contact I made at the Albuquerque law firm. His name is Morton Webb. He knows how the debt documents were prepared." Henry stared at her. "How did you find Morton Webb?" "Mrs. Flores," Belle said simply. "She has excellent contacts in Albuquerque. The woman knows everyone, and people talk to her because she is steady and discreet." Belle looked up from her notebook. "I need you to go with me to speak to Soto because he will be more comfortable with the sheriff present. Webb will require a letter of protection and possibly a travel payment to come to Harlan Creek for the hearing." "I can authorize both," Henry said. "I know you can," Belle said. "That is why I asked." He looked at her across his desk and felt something that was becoming familiar, a deep warmth beneath the professional clarity between them, the warmth of 2 people who had found in each other the rare experience of being met fully. He had been alone in this work for 4 years, not literally alone, but alone in the way that matters, the way where you carry the weight of what you know and what you are trying to do without anyone to share the carrying with. And Belle Turner had come into his office and simply picked up half of it without being asked, as if she had always intended to. He cleared his throat. "Belle," he said, using her name for the first time, and she went very still for a moment, just a fraction, and then looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that after this is over, whatever happens with the case and the property, I hope you are considering staying in Harlan Creek." She held his gaze. "I have been considering it," she said. That was all either of them said about it that morning, but it sat between them for the rest of the day like a lamp that has been lit and cannot be unlit. The visit to Soto went well. He was a man of about 50, a Mexican land grant holder whose family had been on that eastern pasture for 2 generations, and he had the patience of a man who has survived worse things than Calhoun Reed and knows that what is required is endurance combined with right action. He spoke carefully to Henry through Belle, who translated where needed, and what he described was meticulous and damning. A visit from Reed's rider with a document, pressure. A second visit, more pressure. A threat against his grandchildren that was not explicit but was perfectly clear. And then the document filed and the riders on his land before he could respond. He would swear to all of it before the circuit judge. On the way back to town, riding along the creek bed trail with the late sun turning the red rock amber, Henry said, "You knew he would talk if you came with me rather than going alone." He needed to see that the law was behind it, Belle said, that it was not just me. She was riding a steady bay mare she had hired from the livery stable, and she sat a horse well, with the easy competence of someone who had grown up doing it. He has been waiting for someone to make this move for 6 months. He just needed a reason to believe it would hold. And you gave him that reason. We gave him that reason, she corrected. There was a brief silence between them filled with the creek and the wind. Henry. She used his name with the same careful weight he had used hers. Why do you believe the law can hold here? Not as a professional answer, the real one. He considered the question the way she considered everything, with full attention. Because I have seen what happens when it does not, he said. I watched my father's land get taken when I was 14, by a man who had lawyers and we did not, and my father never recovered from it. Not the poverty he could have managed, but the understanding that the thing he believed in, which was that honesty and work should be enough, was not sufficient protection. It broke something in him. He paused. I decided at 14 that I was going to be the thing that stood between that and other people if I could. It is not a complicated reason. Belle turned to look at him in the amber light. He was riding beside her close enough that the horses were nearly shoulder to shoulder on the narrow trail, and the last light was on the side of his face, and she felt something shift in her chest with the force and quietness of a deep river turning. It is not a complicated reason, she agreed softly, but it is a good one. They rode the rest of the way into Harlan Creek in a companionable silence that was not empty at all. Morton Webb arrived in Harlan Creek 9 days before the circuit judge was due, escorted by 2 deputies Henry had deputized from among the town's most reliable men. And he was a small, nervous man in a traveling suit who looked like someone who had spent the past several months expecting to be found. He checked into Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, where Belle was also staying, and Belle spent 2 full days interviewing him at the table in Mrs. Caldwell's front room, while Henry sat nearby taking formal notes. What Morton Webb knew was consequential. He had worked as a junior clerk for the Santa Fe law firm that handled Reed's territorial acquisitions, and he had been present during the preparation of the debt documentation. He did not know specifically how the debt was fabricated. That part was handled by the senior partners. But he knew the timeline, and the timeline was devastating. In 3 of the 4 cases, including Daniel Turner's, the documentation had been prepared before any supposed debt existed, before any supposed agreement, before any transaction of any kind that would have generated such a debt. The documents were forged, prepared in advance, and then filed at the precise moment Reed's operation needed them. He knew this because he had made copies of the preparation logs before he left, and he had brought those copies with him inside the lining of his traveling case. Belle looked at those documents for a long time without speaking. "You kept these," she said finally. "I did not know what I was going to do with them," Webb said, with the honesty of a man who has decided it is too late to be anything other than honest. "I knew what we were doing was wrong. I left the firm. I told myself it was enough." "It was not enough, I know that." "No," Belle agreed quietly. "It was not, but you are here now." She organized the documents with the same meticulous care she had brought to everything else, numbered them, copied them in her own hand, filed them with Henry and with Mrs. Caldwell, and wrote up a full accounting of Webb's testimony that Webb signed in the presence of Henry and Mrs. Caldwell as witnesses, because she was not going to let any part of this structure have a weakness that could be exploited. That evening, Henry came to the boarding house not in the professional capacity, but simply knocked on the door, had dinner with Belle and Mrs. Caldwell, helped Mrs. Caldwell carry in firewood afterward, and then sat with Belle on the narrow porch in the cool evening air with 2 cups of coffee and the stars coming out above the mesas one by one. "We have it," Henry said. "We have most of it," Belle said carefully. We still need the judge to receive it correctly. Reed's lawyers will be there. They will try to attack Webb's credibility and the chain of custody of those documents. We need to be prepared for every angle of attack." "You have been prepared for every angle since before you arrived," Henry said, and there was no qualification in his voice, only the warm certainty of someone stating a fact. She turned to look at him. The porch was narrow and they were sitting close together, and the night was that particular quality of New Mexico night that is simultaneously enormous and intimate, the way a very large fire is. "I have not been afraid," she said, and then corrected herself with unusual honesty. "That is not entirely true. I was afraid the night I found that note on my pillow, not of the threat so much as I was afraid for a moment that it would work, that I would feel it and decide it was not worth it." "But you did not," Henry said. "No," she said. "I thought about Daniel instead, about the fact that he came out here believing the same things you believe, that honest work should be enough protection. And it was not." Her voice was steady but not easy. "I cannot give him back what was taken, but I can make certain the person who took it answers for it. That felt more important than being afraid." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the careful honesty of a man saying something he has thought about a great deal, "I am going to say something and I want you to take it for exactly what it is, which is not a professional opinion and not something that needed saying for any strategic reason." He looked at the stars. "I have never met anyone like you, Belle. I have met brave people and I have met smart people and I have met people with the kind of moral certainty that does not bend, but I have not met all of those things at once in the same person. And he stopped, tried again. "I know the timing is not ideal, but I do not think I am going to stop feeling what I feel about you simply because it is not the ideal time to feel it." The porch was quiet. Somewhere in the town a door closed. The stars were enormous. Belle Turner, who was precise about everything, set down her coffee cup with great care and said, "The timing is actually terrible." She paused. "But I have been aware of what I feel since about the third day, and I am tired of pretending I have not been. So," she turned to face him fully, and there was color in her face that was not from the evening air, and her eyes were very direct. "I am not a person who wants to be cautious about things that are real." Henry Brooks looked at her for a moment in the enormous New Mexico starlight, and then he reached across the narrow space of the porch and took her hand, carefully, in both of his, and held it with the kind of gentleness that is not hesitation but intention. And they sat like that for a long time, watching the stars come out over the mesas, not saying anything because there was nothing that needed to be said that they had not already said. In the morning, Harlan Creek woke to the news that Calhoun Reed had ridden to Santa Fe overnight. His riders were still in town, but Reed himself had gone, which Henry interpreted immediately as a man who had received word that things were moving faster than expected and needed to get his legal team in motion. Belle interpreted it the same way and sent a wire to Mr. Vargas in Albuquerque with the update, and Vargas wired back within hours that he was already in communication with the circuit judge's office and that the judge was prepared to move the date of arrival forward if the circumstances warranted. They warranted it. The judge arrived in Harlan Creek in 5 days rather than 12. The hearing was held in the church, which was the only building large enough, and it lasted 2 days. Reed had returned from Santa Fe with 2 lawyers, both of them skilled and well-dressed and utterly committed to their client's case with the professional dedication of people who are being paid extremely well. They attacked Webb's credibility first, as expected, and Belle was ready for it. She had prepared Henry on exactly how to present the chain of custody for the preparation logs so that the physical evidence spoke for itself regardless of what anyone said about Webb personally, and Mr. Vargas, who had traveled from Albuquerque for the hearing, argued the chain of custody with a precision and legal fluency that left Reed's lawyers doing something that looked uncomfortably like improvising. Amos Prout took the stand on the second morning, and gave his eyewitness account of the day Daniel Turner died. He had been at the creek crossing 300 yards away. He had not seen a riding accident. He had seen two men from Reed's crew, recognizable by their horses and their gear, in the same location at the same time. He had seen Daniel Turner alive at dawn, and he had seen him dead by mid-morning, and the ground between those two states contained Reed's men and nothing else. The church was very quiet when Prout finished. Reed's lawyers made objections. The judge heard them. He noted them carefully, and then he heard Soto, and he heard the documentary evidence, and he heard Henry's testimony about the pattern and the timeline. And by the end of the second day, the circuit judge had rendered a finding of probable criminal conspiracy and fraud against Calhoun Reed's operation, had voided the debt documentation against all four properties as fraudulent, had restored the property records to their original holders, and had issued a warrant for Reed's arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and, pending further investigation by territorial marshals, as an accessory in the death of Daniel Turner. Reed was arrested in his Harlan Creek office that afternoon by Henry and two deputies. He went quietly, with the pale, cold calm of a man who knows he has lost this particular round and is already calculating the next move, and Henry took him to the jail and locked the cell door and stood for a moment in the quiet of his office with the desert afternoon around him. And for the first time in 3 months, he could breathe without the specific weight he had been carrying. He walked to Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house and found Belle on the porch, and she was standing very still with her hands at her sides and her eyes were bright, and she looked at him when he came up the steps and he said, "It is done." And she closed her eyes for a moment with the quality of a person who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has just been given permission to set it down. He took her hands and held them the way he had on the Porch of Stars, and she pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder, and that was where they were when Mrs. Caldwell came out with 2 cups of the good coffee and pretended she had not noticed anything by being extremely interested in the state of the porch railing. The aftermath of the hearing moved in several directions at once. The territorial marshals arrived within a week and took custody of the case against Reed, which would be prosecuted in the federal court. The debt documentation frauds against all 4 property holders were officially voided. So, returned to his eastern pasture. The 2 families who had simply left one of them had gone as far as Colorado, were located through the marshal's office, and notified that their properties were legally restored to them, and one of them returned. Morton Webb was offered protection in exchange for continued cooperation with the federal prosecution, which he accepted with the relief of a man who has been exhausted by his own guilt. And Belle Turner went to her brother's property. Henry rode out with her on a clear September morning in 1882, a week after the hearing. The fence with the Reed Cattle Company sign had been removed by the marshals, and the property was exactly what the ashes and the grave and the good clear land had always said it was: 40 acres on the south-facing slope of a long mesa, with the north corner producing a reliable spring that Daniel had found and marked with a stack of stones, the spring still running clean and steady as if it had been waiting. Belle stood at the spring for a long time. Then she went to her brother's grave and stood there too, and Henry stayed at a respectful distance and let her have that time, which she needed, and which she used with the same complete attention she brought to everything. He sat on a flat red rock and looked at the 40 acres and thought about what a person could do with it, thought about it with a specific personal investment that he acknowledged to himself without pretending it was something other than what it was. When she came back to where he was, her eyes were red at the edges in the way of someone who has been crying efficiently and briefly, and she sat on the rock beside him and looked at the land. "It is good land," she said. "Very good," he agreed. "He was right about the water," she said. "The spring is strong. You can feel the pressure of it." "A spring like that is the foundation of something," Henry said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the land and the sky and the long mesa line. Then she said, in the voice she used for things that were precise and real, "I am going to build here." Henry looked at her. "You have decided." "I decided on the stagecoach," she said, "before I even arrived. I just needed to know that justice was possible first." She turned to face him, and she looked at him with the full, direct quality of her attention. "I am going to need help with the building. Not with the labor exactly, I can hire labor, but with the other things. The permits, the water rights, the ongoing complications of being a woman who owns land in the New Mexico Territory in 1882, which are going to be numerous and persistent." "They are," Henry said, holding her gaze. "You will need someone who knows this territory and its legal structure." "I will," she agreed. "I was hoping that person might be willing to occupy a role that was somewhat more permanent than consultant." She paused, and there was a color in her face again, that warm, rising color that was one of the few things that did not come under her complete management. "I am asking you something, Henry. You know what I am asking." He did know. He looked at her for a moment, at Belle Turner, who had arrived in his doorway with a legal deed and a notebook, and the absolute certainty of a person who knew the difference between a dream and a plan, who had walked into the middle of the most dangerous situation in this territory, with nothing but her intelligence and her refusal to accept injustice, who had dismantled a criminal operation in 3 weeks from the ground up, and had done it with a precision and courage that he would be telling people about for the rest of his life. And he felt the full weight of what he felt about her, which was not a light thing and not a simple thing, but was entirely clear. "Belle Turner," he said, and he turned on the rock to face her fully, with the mesa and the sky behind him and the spring running quietly nearby. "I came to Harlan Creek 4 years ago because I thought a small enough place might be one where a person could make a difference. I did not know what I was actually waiting for until you walked up to my door. And I want to say this precisely. I am not asking because it is practical or because the circumstances suggest it or because the timing is finally right, though I believe it is. I am asking because you are the first person I have met who changed what I understand about what is possible." He took both her hands in his. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment with her precise dark eyes, and then she said, "Yes. Obviously yes." And she said it with the particular tone she used for things that were simply true, not breathlessly, not with romantic drama, but with the complete and settled certainty of someone confirming a fact that has already been established, and it was more romantic than any performance could have been. He kissed her in the September sun with the red mesas around them, and the spring running, and the 40 acres of good land stretching in every direction. And she kissed him back with her whole attention, which was the only way she ever did anything. They were married in the Harlan Creek church on a Saturday morning in October of 1882, and it was not a large wedding because neither of them was inclined toward spectacle, but it was full in the way that counted. Mrs. Caldwell was there, and was extremely satisfied with herself. Amos Prout came in his good suit. Soto came with his family, including 4 grandchildren who occupied the front pew with the specific energy of children who have been told to be still. Mrs. Flores came and brought a wedding gift of extremely good coffee and a bolt of calico fabric, which Belle laughed at because only Mrs. Flores would give calico as a wedding gift and make it feel exactly right. Mr. Vargas sent a letter from Albuquerque with congratulations and a note that the federal prosecution of Calhoun Reed was proceeding strongly and that he expected a conviction within the year. Henry stood at the front of that church in his good shirt with the desert light coming through the small side windows, and when Belle came down the aisle, in a dress she had made herself from good blue wool, because she was not going to pay someone else to make her wedding dress when she had been a dressmaker's assistant for 5 years. She looked at him with the full direct quality of her gaze, and he thought, for perhaps the 100th time since the morning she had stood in his doorway and dismantled his warnings about dreamers, that he had been entirely wrong about what the frontier was cruel to. It was not cruel to people like Belle Turner. It did not know how to be. They honeymooned in Albuquerque for a week, which was practical because they needed to meet with Mr. Vargas in person to settle several matters related to the property rights and the ongoing federal case. And Belle absolutely refused to call it only a honeymoon when there was useful work to be done in the same location. And Henry found this completely wonderful and not at all surprising. They came back to Harlan Creek and began building. The house on Daniel Turner's 40 acres went up over the winter of 1882 and into the spring of 1883, built by Henry and 3 hired men from the territory who knew adobe construction, with Belle directing specifications that she had been designing in her notebook since September. It was not a large house, but it was precise 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a good stove, a front room with enough space for a proper table and bookshelf, a porch on the south side to catch the afternoon light. The spring was incorporated into a cistern system that Henry designed with the help of a water engineer Belle had located through the Albuquerque contacts, and the cistern was sufficient to water not only the house but a kitchen garden, and eventually the small irrigated fields that Belle had planned for the north slope. She had a plan for the land that was detailed and completely sensible mixed crop cultivation on the irrigated section, a small orchard of fruit trees on the south slope, and the spring water sold to 3 neighboring properties under a water rights agreement that Mr. Vargas drew up, and that provided a steady income independent of the agriculture. She was not romantic about farming. She was extremely practical about it. She made decisions about the land the way she made all decisions, with full information and complete follow-through, and the land responded to that treatment the way good land does, steadily, generously, with the reliable return of honest investment. Henry continued as sheriff through 1883 and into 1884, and he was better at the work than he had been before, which was partly because the Reed case had established his standing in the territory in a way that made certain kinds of corruption more difficult to attempt in his jurisdiction, and partly because he was no longer alone in the way that had been wearing him down without his fully acknowledging it. He came home to the house on the 40 acres every evening to Belle, and the lamp on the table, and the good coffee, and the notebook in which she was now documenting the agricultural progress with the same meticulous attention she had once brought to the documentation of fraud, and he found that the work did not have the specific exhausting weight it had carried before, because the weight was shared now. Calhoun Reed was convicted in the federal court in January of 1884 on 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy in the illegal acquisition of land in the New Mexico Territory, and on 1 count as an accessory to the unlawful death of Daniel Turner. The marshals had built a strong case from Pruitt's testimony and physical evidence at the site, and Reed's own writers had, when faced with the full scope of the federal charges, made statements that sealed the case. He received a sentence of 20 years in the federal penitentiary, which was a sentence that the judge described as a message to anyone who thought the territorial law was a suggestion. When Henry told Belle, she was standing at the kitchen stove with her back to him, and she went very still for a moment when he finished speaking, and then she set down the spoon she was holding and turned around, and her eyes were wet, and she did not try to manage it the way she usually managed things. She just let herself feel it fully for a moment, the completion of what she had come here to do. The justice that was real and legal and on the record, and then Henry crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her, and she pressed her face against his chest and let herself be held, which was something she did not often allow herself. "For Daniel," he said quietly. "For Daniel," she agreed. They stood like that in the kitchen for a long time with the stove ticking warmly and the land outside going gold in the winter afternoon light. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, and they named him Daniel Brooks, which was decided between them without needing much discussion, and he arrived with a full head of dark hair and the apparent intention of being as loud as possible about everything, which Belle found both exhausting and deeply funny. She had strong opinions about raising children that included treating them as fully rational people from the earliest possible age, which Henry found completely consistent with everything else about her, and which also meant that Daniel Brooks, from the time he was old enough to follow a conversation, was included in the household discussions about land management and legal matters, and the general operation of their lives in a way that made him unusually thoughtful for his age. The house on the 40 acres grew to accommodate the growing household. Henry added a room in 1885, when it became clear that 40 acres with a reliable spring was attracting the kind of prosperity that required more space. A proper study, where Belle maintained her accounts and correspondence, because her water rights agreements and agricultural operation had grown to the point where they occupied as much of her attention as the house. And she managed both with a calm organizational fluency that made everyone who dealt with her professionally slightly uncertain whether they were in the presence of a farmer's wife or an extremely capable businesswoman. She was both. She saw no reason that should be puzzling. In 1885, Harlan Creek had its own expansion of a particular kind. The railroad spur that the territorial authority had been planning for 2 years was confirmed, and a station would be built 12 miles east of town, which was going to change the economic landscape of the entire basin. Belle saw this coming 4 months before it was announced because she had been following the Territorial Land Commission reports, which she subscribed to by post, and she had quietly secured a water supply contract with the proposed railroad company through Mr. Vargas before the announcement was made, which secured a 20-year income for the Turner Brooks Water Company, which was the name she had given the water operation. Henry, when she told him about the contract, was quiet for a moment and then said, "The Turner Brooks Water Company. I use both names professionally," she said. "It establishes continuity with the original land claim and also reflects the current ownership accurately." "It is perfect," he said. "I know," she said, and smiled at him with the warm, private precision of a smile that was only for him. The summer of 1885 brought a wave of new settlers into the Harlan Creek Basin, drawn by the railroad announcement, and with new settlers came the fresh opportunity for the kind of conflict and injustice that Henry was positioned to manage, and he managed it with the authority of a man whose record in the territory was well known by that point. He was offered a territorial marshal's appointment in the fall of 1885, which would have meant traveling the territory and leaving the 40 acres and the life they had built, and he spent 3 days thinking about it with the genuine seriousness the question deserved before he declined it. "I am not leaving," he told the appointment officer. "Sheriff Brooks, I am where I intend to be," he said. "The work here is not finished." It was not finished, but it was deepening. The character of Harlan Creek was changing from the barely held territory it had been when Henry arrived to something more genuinely built, and Belle's operation contributed to that change in a practical way. The water system she had developed became the template for 3 other private water operations in the basin, and she was asked to consult on each of them, which she did with a thoroughness that made Mr. Vargas suggest that she could build a successful practice in land and water law. "I do not have the legal degree," she said. "There are women studying law now in certain Eastern institutions," Vargas said carefully. Belle thought about this for 2 weeks and then wrote 3 letters, 2 to institutions in the East and 1 to Mr. Vargas, and began a process that would take 3 years and involve a considerable amount of correspondence study and 1 extended trip to New Mexico's capital, but resulted in 1888 in her being admitted to the territorial bar through a provision for practitioners with demonstrable expertise. A provision that was rare and required substantial advocacy from Mr. Vargas and 2 circuit judges, who had been observing her work with considerable respect for some time. Henry was present at the admission ceremony in Santa Fe, which was in the State House building on a Tuesday morning in October of 1888, and he stood with young Daniel on his shoulder. Daniel was 4 and had opinions about the ceremony that he expressed in an ongoing quiet commentary into his father's ear, and he watched Belle Turner Brooks receive the admission document with the same complete composed dignity she had walked into everything with. And he felt a fullness in his chest that had no clean name, but that he had learned to trust as one of the truest feelings he knew. She turned and found him in the small audience, and her face, for just a moment, was entirely unguarded, fully happy, fully present, the way she was occasionally when she allowed herself to be, and it was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. They had dinner that evening in a good Santa Fe restaurant, the kind with tablecloths and wine and real beef, which was a luxury they marked for significant occasions, and Daniel fell asleep under the table on Henry's coat between the appetizer and the main course, and they talked over his sleeping head about what came next with the same pleasure they had always taken in planning, not with anxiety or urgency, but with the particular delight of two people who trust each other completely and find the future genuinely interesting. "What do you want the practice to look like?" Henry asked. "Land and water rights primarily," Belle said. "There are families in this territory who need representation they can afford, the kind I could not find for Daniel at first. Small holders, land-grant families, people whose claims are technically solid but who do not know how to defend them legally." She turned her wine glass in her fingers. "I want to do for them what Mr. Vargas did for us." "You are already doing that," Henry said. "I want to do it formally," she said, "with a proper office." She looked at him with a slight smile. "The dry goods store on Main Street has a back room that has been unused since the Prescott family moved to Tucson. I spoke to the building owner last month." Henry laughed, a real laugh, warm and complete. "Of course you did. It is a good space," she said primly. "Good natural light and sufficient room for a proper filing system." He reached across the tablecloth and took her hand, and she turned it to hold his properly, and they stayed like that over their dinner in the warm lamplight of the Santa Fe restaurant with their son asleep under the table and the October night outside. And Henry thought about the morning Belle had come to his door with a deed and a notebook, and told him she was not a dreamer, and he thought about how right she had been, and about what the difference looked like between a dream and something real. A dream is beautiful and breakable, but what Belle had built was neither of those things. It was solid and growing, and as close to permanent as anything on this earth managed to be. They went home to Harlan Creek the next morning, and to the house on the 40 acres, and the spring still running, and the small orchard coming into its second good year of fruit, and the son who had woken at dawn demanding to see the horses, and life resumed with the happy, ordinary richness of a life that was exactly where it was supposed to be. The law office of Belle Turner Brooks opened on Main Street in Harlan Creek in December of 1888, and it was, as she had said, a good space with natural light and a filing system that made Mr. Vargas, who came for the opening and looked it over, described it as the best organized legal practice he had ever seen, which Belle acknowledged with a thank you and an offer of coffee. Her first case was a Navajo land claim in the Eastern Basin, brought to her by a man named Chavez who had heard about her from Soto and who had been trying to get someone to represent the claim for 2 years. The case was complicated and politically difficult and involved treaty language that required intensive historical research, and Belle wrote more letters in the 3 months following the opening than she had written in the previous 3 years combined, and she won the case before a territorial arbitration board in March of 1889, which was the first successful representation of a native land claim before a New Mexico territorial board in the recorded history of the territory, and which Mr. Vargas wrote about in a legal journal published in Albuquerque as a landmark case. Henry pinned the copy of that journal to the wall of his office next to the territorial code and the circuit judge's standing orders, and when anyone asked him about it, which they sometimes did, he told them exactly what his wife had done and how she had done it, with the precision and detail the thing deserved. Their daughter arrived in June of 1889, the second child, and they named her Clara, after Henry's mother, who had been a woman of uncommon strength and had died when Henry was 22. Clara arrived with the same dark hair as Daniel and an expression of deep consideration that made Mrs. Caldwell, who was present for the birth, say that she had never seen a newborn look more like she was already evaluating the situation. Belle, who was exhausted and flushed and entirely happy, said, "She takes after her father." Henry, who was sitting beside the bed holding Belle's hand with a grip that had become gradually tighter throughout the labor and was now at a pressure that Belle had decided not to mention, said, "She absolutely takes after her mother." They were both right. Clara Brooks grew up to be a person of uncommon precision and warmth, which was what happened when both of your parents were that kind of person. The decade turned, and the world moved around Harlan Creek in ways that the territory could feel even out in the basin. Political changes, the approaching statehood question, the railroad making the whole region more connected, the particular combination of growth and loss that is the character of a place in the middle of being made. Henry remained sheriff through 1891, when he was elected to the Harlan Creek Town Council at the same election, which was a new civic structure the town had voted to establish, and he served on both simultaneously for a year before deciding that the council work was where he could do the most at that specific moment in the town's development, and transitioning out of the sheriff role to a deputy who had trained under him for 3 years and who Henry trusted completely. He came home from his last day as sheriff and told Belle, and she looked at him across the supper table where Daniel was eating with the focused efficiency of a 7-year-old, and Clara was attempting to feed herself with a spoon for the first time, and she said, "How do you feel?" "Good," he said, after a moment. "Ready." He looked at the kitchen and the good stove and the south-facing window that caught the evening light, and at his wife and children in the warm, ordinary, extraordinary fact of them. "Ready for the next thing. The council needs good land policy," Belle said. "The statehood question is going to require it. The territorial code is going to change significantly when statehood comes through, and someone needs to be in the room making sure that the small holders have representation in how those changes are structured." "I know," he said. "That is why I said yes." She smiled at him across the table. Daniel looked up from his plate and said, with the clarity of a 7-year-old who has spent his entire life at a table where the adults discuss things that matter, "Are you going to make the laws better?" "We are going to try," Belle said. "Good," Daniel said, and went back to eating. Henry looked at Belle across the table with the lamplight warm between them, the same lamplight that had been between them at Mrs. Caldwell's table in the beginning, a different lamp in a different room that was theirs now and had been built by their hands, and was full of everything they had made together. And he felt the full, settled warmth of a life that had grown exactly as far as it had meant to grow, and further. In the spring of 1893, on a morning that was all clear blue sky, and the orchard coming into bloom with the small white flowers that smelled like something purely good, Henry was sitting on the south porch watching the land when Belle came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him in the second chair, and they watched the orchard together for a while. "I have been thinking," Belle said. "You are always thinking," he said. "I have been thinking specifically," she amended, "about the east quarter of the property. The soil there has been tested by the new surveying team that passed through, and it has a clay composition that is suitable for adobe brick production. There is increasing demand for building material with the growth rate this basin is seeing." Henry considered this. "An adobe works. A small one," she said. "I have been speaking with Soto's eldest son, who has experience in adobe production, about a partnership structure." Henry looked at her for a moment. They had been married for 11 years. He was 42, and she was 35, and they had built something together that was more substantial and more good than either of them had stood in the Santa Fe land office dreaming about, because neither of them had stood in a land office dreaming. They had stood in land offices planning, which was a different thing and which produced different results. "You have already drafted the partnership terms," he said. "They are preliminary," she said, with the slight smile that was the version she reserved for being caught in thoroughness. "I wanted to discuss them with you first." "Show me," he said. She went inside and came back with the notebook. A different one from the original. This was perhaps the 7th or 8th notebook she had kept since arriving in Harlan Creek, all of them filed on the study shelf in the house. And she opened it to the relevant pages, and they went over it together in the orchard-scented morning with the coffee between them. This was what a life looked like when it was built rather than dreamed, when it was made out of clear-eyed attention and work, and the particular joy of two people who had found each other in the specific way they had found each other. Not softly, not easily, but in the middle of a fight that mattered, in the presence of danger, in the proving of a thing that needed proving, and who had recognized in each other not just what they needed but what they were. Henry had told Belle Turner the frontier was cruel to dreamers. She had told him she was not a dreamer and proved it. And the proof was 40 acres on a mesa in New Mexico in the spring of 1893, with a good house and a working spring and a kitchen garden and an orchard in bloom, with 2 children who would grow up knowing that the law was something you used, and that land was something you built, and that love was something you chose every day with your whole attention. With a man sitting beside her on the porch who had been wrong about her and right about everything that mattered and who had the permanent happy knowledge of both facts, and with a life that was solid and real and full to its edges, with the specific irreplaceable richness of something that was entirely their own. Belle closed the notebook. The orchard moved in a small wind that came down off the mesa. Somewhere in the house, Daniel was waking up, his voice carrying through the window with the morning's first round of opinions. Clara would be next, with her careful evaluating silence that meant she was already absorbing information before she committed to speech. Henry put his arm around Belle's shoulders, and she leaned into him with her complete attention, and they sat in the spring morning of Harlan Creek in the year 1893, in the territory that was not yet a state but would be, in the land that had been fought for and won, and was now being built into something that would outlast them, and that carried all of it. The letters and the notebook and the deed and the hearing and the cold pale, eyes of a man now in a federal prison, and the warm lamplight of the first evenings at Mrs. Caldwell's table and the stars on the narrow porch and the red mesa light and the spring running clean and the growing deep sure warmth of two people who had come to the frontier and had not been broken by it, had not been softened by it, had not retreated from it, but had instead, with full clear-eyed intention, built something in it that was meant to last. The orchard bloomed. The spring ran. The morning opened wide and clear over the mesas. Belle Turner Brooks was not a dreamer. She had proved it every single day.